wants to get us started? It looks like Carol has a question for us. Let's let her get us started. Oh, Carol, you're still on mute.
Okay, then.
There you go.
Does the governor of New York have the authority to remove the mayor of New York City for cause? And if yes, will she?
Wait, I believe, and I'm not certain on this because obviously this Eric Adams controversy or the latest version of it has just erupted in the last day or so. I believe that the governor does have that authority because I do remember this from a previous controversy, although I'd have to check to be sure, Carol. What I would say is, unless the mayor were incredibly unpopular, much more than Adams is at this point, I think it would be an immense risk on the part of the governor. Because I think for a lot of New York City residents who make up a disproportionate percentage of the state's electorate, they would see it as an encroachment upon their standing as the city. So I do believe, again, not certain, but I do believe that the governor has that authority. But I think it would be very unusual circumstances under which they take the political risk to use it. Okay. I see a few points in the chat box, and Diane, I agree with you. After I finished talking about TPS, or before I started talking about TPS, I assumed that they meant TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that's why I talked about Saudi Arabia expanding its trade footprint nationally. But it occurred to me after I finished answering, before Maddie went on to the next question, that if the questioner did in fact mean TPS in terms of immigration and refugee status, I should at least address it to be safe. So short version is Saudi Arabia is probably not going to end up in TPP, but is a better chance of ending up in it than TPS. Rick, what are you thinking about, Rick?
So my question is about Ukraine. In terms of, as obviously this is just the beginning of all of these gambits and strategies about what kind of negotiations will occur and what they'll look like. But in terms of eventual guarantees for Ukraine's security, I know that the U.S. unilaterally could veto any Ukrainian application for NATO citizenship because it requires unanimity. So the U.S. alone could veto the Ukrainians' attempt to join NATO. But do you think it's both? Do you think it's possible, and do you think it's likely that even if Trump and joined with Putin to put pressure on and basically threatened to or did unilaterally withdraw all American support from Ukraine, that the Europeans, either together through the European Union or individually, would continue to support Ukraine in a way that might allow Ukraine to continue fighting?
Well, I think two separate but closely related questions. I think even the threat of a US veto, without it actually being implemented, would give pause to Europe pursuing NATO membership. Even in a dramatically weakened NATO alliance, I don't think Europe wants to further inflame it by ignoring the US. That said, I think when it comes to military and economic assistance, Europe would not be able to provide the same level without the US. Frankly, the stakes are so much higher for many, if not all of their members. I don't think Europe would have any choice but to continue. And as you see the German elections coming up, the front runner there, Merz, is already talking a much more aggressive game on Russia than Schultz has during his time in office. The Eastern European countries, of course, with the exception of Hungary and maybe Slovakia, would be very invested in it. But I think you'd see most of the NATO alliance not only maintaining its involvement, but potentially looking for ways to increase it, absent U.S. involvement. Again, it would not be an ideal situation for them, but they correctly see the stakes as much higher, at least in the immediate.
And just a quick follow-up. I mean,
Yeah.
I know a few months ago, French President Macron hinted at the possibility of French troops going into Ukraine, not as part of NATO, but just as part under French auspices only. So there's already been some discussion about something like that. And do you think that's likely to increase?
I think it is likely to increase. I say this, Macron can be extremely mercurial, and he's very, very talented at attracting international attention, both on the issues in which he's addressing, but also to move attention away from the things he'd rather not be discussing, like these rotating prime ministers he seems to be dealing with for the foreseeable future. But he wouldn't raise something like that if he didn't see a benefit for both France and other European countries having more individual engagement. So I think it is a real thing, and I don't think he is the only European leader who'd seriously consider it.
Thanks.
Okay. Roger, how about you?
Okay. The way Trump's approaching changes, is he a negotiating genius? Is he just checking off the Project 25 stuff? Is it ready, fire, aim? What's your opinion there?
The honest answer, certainly my own opinions, but my honest answer is we don't know. And I'll take the Gaza discussion we're having as an example. There's no way in the world, as I told Maddie and all of you in the broader discussion, that the US is going to take over Gaza and eject almost 2 million Palestinian residents. That said, if that outlandish proposal can motivate Egypt and other Arab countries into playing a more active role with a more aggressive level of investment, then that is a potentially positive outcome. And whether that is an unexpected benefit or the result of strategic genius, I'm not smart enough. I believe, as I've told all of you before, I believe that there are two things that motivate Trump. One is ideology and the other is attention. And when the two overlap, you can get a pretty good sense of where he's going. He is right in a number of places. I will give him credit, even though I oppose him more broadly on trade policy. He's the first American president since Nixon to call out China for fairly egregious oversteps in terms of their role in the international marketplace in our trade relationship. Was that genius or was that just bluster ending up in the right place? I have no idea. So this is my long-winded way of saying, Roger, no clue. Why don't you ask me an easier question, like who's going to win the NBA championship?
Or is the government going to continue to function with Trump's drive-by shooting approach to reducing the workforce?
I do believe that while he's going to be successful in some of the court fights, I think a lot of them are going to end up going against him. And I do think it's a relatively small matter and it's early, but it is noticeable just in the last 48 to 72 hours, noting the growing number of Republican members of Congress who are expressing their concerns about some of these cuts. Because it's one thing as a conservative to support cutting a nameless, faceless bureaucrat and saving the government money. It's another to take the same step when it impacts your constituents in your own district, in your own state. And I don't think Elon Musk's X-Acto knife is precise enough to only make those cuts in blue states and not red. So there will be cuts. We will have a significantly smaller U.S. government workforce in 2029 than we do today. And we'll see then whether its impact is closer to what Trump thinks or what the Democrats think. But I don't think it will be as all-encompassing as Trump and Musk are talking about right now, not only because of the judicial branch, but because of Republicans who, as much as they are loyal to Trump, worry first about their own reelection campaigns.
Well, thank you for keeping the Zoom things going in the future for us remote people. Thank
Yeah, I lobbied for doing one of the hybrids in the Carolinas, but I lost that
you.
argument.
Okay.
Apologize. Okay, I see that Sid and Sandy have their hand up. Oh, and Sid, I think you're on mute also. Oh, so Sid, we're still not able to hear you because of the mute button. So
Apologize about having that button muted.
I do it all the time.
Uh, What I wanted to say is I disagree with you about Trump's motives. And without going into the long details, I do agree with Bernie Sanders that his goal is to turn this country into a kleptocracy for his benefit. The other things that you've mentioned really are scatterbrained ideas that he comes up with while he's sitting on his throne or wherever, and he disseminates them in unorthodox manner, unnecessarily. So anyhow, that's where I disagree with you.
Well, I think your first point, I think both points are very valid. And as I tried to say to Roger, I don't pretend to know the answer. Where I would definitely agree with you is there's no question that his other motivation, aside from attention and ideology, is financial. And the number of ways that he has looked to reap financial benefit for himself and his family through his candidacy and his presidency is unprecedented. And I should have mentioned that. The reason I didn't is I was thinking in terms of issues where his direct financial benefit was not as apparent. But I think it's very fair of you to raise it because there's ample evidence to back you up on that. Whether that's instead of policy motivations or along with, like I said, I'm not smart enough to know. But I certainly concede your point that that's an incentive that we need to consider also. I'm glad you pointed it out, and I'm glad we got you off mute. Good. Well, Melissa,
Hey, Dan. I wondered what your opinion would be on inflation, to the extent that it would likely, increase due to the uncertainty with the trade, tariffs, or maybe that just takes some time, when we actually see it coming through. But is that a third rail? Do you think that that would be some way to pare back Trump's aggressiveness, or I just get your feedback on that with respect to inflation in general and maybe specific to the trade fallout?
I think that is his Achilles heel. Even in the CBS poll that showed him with a 53% approval rating, almost 2/3 of respondents said that they didn't think he was doing enough on inflation. And yeah, he might be right. Dramatically increased tariffs might not have any effect on it at all. But most economists who I read disagree with him pretty vehemently.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like both in terms of consumers and also the markets,
Mm-hmm.
if he sees inflation going up, it's one thing to call it Biden inflation after 3 weeks in office.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a much tougher argument to make later this year or next.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think as the Democrats, and they're still trying to figure out how to respond to him, I think as the Democrats continue to grapple toward a response strategy, I would be very surprised if inflation didn't end up being at the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the combination of inflation for working class voters and a variation of the point that Sid was making, wealthy benefactors, I think it is an argument that could have some salience for them. But this is where this flooding the zone strategy is so impactful. The Democrats don't know where and how
Mm-hmm.
to respond. I suspect they'll come to the place that you're talking about. I don't know how long it'll take before they get here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Super interesting. Thank you.
Of course. Hello, Tim.
Dan, I can't begin to tell you how wonderful it is to have the opportunity to exchange with you.
Likewise.
It truly is. Um, Let me start by saying that I cannot begin to understand when or how I could find inalienable rights. Um, because if there were any, I think they're all gone as far as my Constitution, the way that I read the Constitution. And I thought that they couldn't be taken away. Um, I also would like to say that as far as my reaction to much of what Trump or the Trump administration is doing is one in which there is less shock and surprise, primarily because I don't believe that Trump thinks or is acting symmetrically. And our government and our country has always been governed in a symmetrical, well, since I've been alive, in a symmetrical manner. And once you get to an asymmetric way of thinking, you're not necessarily shocked by his overall actions, but you can be surprised by what some of them are. I finished reading all 900 some odd pages of a 2025 project. And to be honest with you, my response was is the good because there's some good there, the bad, and then there's some absolutely horrible, ugly. In a town hall meeting with Congresswoman Sidney Clemenger, she pointed out that they had already negotiated that there was about $1.5 trillion that could be cut out of the federal government. Musk is going after 2 trillion. The question would be, why wasn't the trillion and a half taken out a long time ago? Right? The last thing. Marco Rubio literally just, I guess, had a conversation with Panama and had them rescind the Belt and Road Initiative for the two ports. I was just last week, I was on a tour of the USS Lincoln down at in San Diego and asked, would a Nimitz-class Air Force aircraft carrier fit through the Panama Canal? It does not. China is building aircraft carriers that fit through the Panama Canal. So there's a lot of things that we ultimately need to take a step back. And rather than allow this man to continue to shock us, we need to be there before he's there and say, you know something, like Canada and Mexico did, we'll do what you want, but we've already done it, idiot. So let's go that route.
Well, Tim, I was saying a moment ago that to Melissa's question, I feel like the Democrats are still struggling to identify a counter strategy. They'd be wise to listen to you because I feel like what Claudia Sheinbaum did in Mexico, with somewhat more respectful language, reflects the strategy that you talked about. She knew where Trump wanted to go, and she got there first. So she basically promised to do the same thing at the border that was already being done, knew that he would get to look like he had strengthened the presence at the border, and she escaped the enhanced tariffs. This is something I teach to my students and that high school athletes learn from their coaches. If you know what your opponent is going to do before they do it, you can keep them from doing it. And so I think you raise a good point on a number of topics. The one I'd come back to in particular, though, is Panama, because your point about the canal is such an important one, and it's so overlooked that for all of Trump's talk about China's takeover of the canal, it's clear, it's been reported that Panama has asked the U.S. for significant financial support in order to broaden and widen it, saying, as you did, if you help us do this, this will make it easier for passage for your trips. Trump, of course, hates the idea of being taken advantage of by another country, so he sees that as being held up. This is his counter to that. I'd be willing to bet, although I don't bet much on politics, that it's more likely that Panama enters into a more forgiving financial relationship with the U.S. in terms of that that canal infrastructure construction than the canal becoming a 51st state. I think the one other thing I'd mention, and just so many good points that you raised, and I know we have other hands up, is you talked about his approach to government. And if you ever read a book by Michael Kranish called Trump Unleashed, It was written during the first Trump campaign. He talks about how Trump, as a young developer with his father, would go to see a Brooklyn ward boss, a guy by the name of Meade Esposito, who's a member of the New York City Council. And as ward bosses tend to do in old school setups like New York and Boston and Chicago, council member Meade Esposito had absolute power on everything that went on in his district. And Kranish posits that that is how young Donald Trump learned about how government worked. That you went to see this one person, and this one person made everything happen that needed to, and has translated that into his approach at a larger level, which when you talk about a balance, that's not the way he witnessed government being conducted, given his first exposure to it as a young developer trying to get permits. Lots of other really interesting points, but I do want to make sure other people in the chat get to weigh in. John has a really interesting question. Do you see the intel community rallying behind the new director of national intelligence or ignoring her? I believe that the overwhelming majority of the intelligence community will do their best to ignore the director whenever they can, but there'll be limits on their ability to do that. These are civil servants. They're not partisan on one side or the other, not traditional Republican or Gabbard Republican, not Democratic. And generally speaking, if they see an appointed official taking steps that they believe compromises national intelligence, they look for ways to resist it. The question going forward is to what extent they'll be able to. But I think the instinct among the large majority of the intelligence community will be to find ways to at least work around her directives. And so it's a really good question. Carol, I see that you have your hand up and a question in the chat. Is your verbal question the same as your written question, or do you have another? Oh, two different Carols. Let's go to Carol's iPad first. Carol, you wanted to talk about the DNC?
Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay. Yes, that was my question. Ken Martin seems to be pretty unexciting and hasn't stirred any excitement among Democrats I've spoken with. Does that matter when it comes to his duties as chair of the Democratic Party? Can he be effective, and who really is his constituency?
Okay. So the honest truth is it doesn't matter all that much. The chairman of a national committee for the party that doesn't hold the White House is almost entirely an organizational and a fundraising position. And the fact that most of the candidates, not just Martin, but Ben Winkler and his other opponents, talked in more logistical terms rather than grand ideology, I think was actually smart on their part. Because a DNC chair, just like an RNC chair under Biden or Obama, doesn't set policy. And to pretend that they do, I think is unfair to party regulars on either side. So he's a mechanic, he's a logistician. He has a good reputation from Minnesota. I don't know if he'll be good or bad in the job, but I give him points from the outset for not pretending that he was going to single-handedly set a Democratic agenda to take the party through January of 2029, because that's not what he's there for. I did see the other news out of Minnesota, which I think is much more important for those of you who didn't see it today, is U.S. Senator Tina Smith, who was originally appointed when Al Franken stepped down and was reelected 2 years later, announced today that she would not run for reelection. She is the second Democratic incumbent senator after Gary Peters from Michigan in the last 10 days to announce that they're not running for reelection. Both are blue states when it comes to the Senate, but neither is a safe Democratic seat. And I think the fact that you have two incumbents stepping down and Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire still undecided suggests a party that is still on its heels. Members of Congress, whether Republican or Democrat, generally don't avoid re-election if they're feeling really good about their prospects. This is the action that a party takes when it believes it's going to be in the minority for a period of time. And I'm not making that prediction. But when senators like Smith and Peters make those kind of announcement, it suggests a mood among Democratic elected officials. that to me is more instructive about the future going forward than Martin. And Tim, you're exactly right. Walz is thinking about running for the seat. So is his lieutenant governor. They already don't like each other. I can only imagine what that next cabinet meeting is going to be like. But the most interesting rumor out of Minnesota is that Al Franken is thinking about running for his old seat. But we may need to save that for our next get together. What do you say? Let's give Carol and Bill the last question, and we'll call it a night.
Let's do it. Bill, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Diane's had her hand up for a long time. If you
Oh,
have
I'm so
time for
sorry.
me after.
Diane, I'm so sorry. So Diane, please go ahead.
No, let Carol go first.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, okay. Speaking as an IT person, I spent my whole career at IBM. When Elon Musk and his staff come in and hoover up all the databases, and some judge says you must destroy all that, that is just a laugh. That is gone.
Well, I will say this, that what Musk has figured out, sort of in the way that Ken Martin did, is that the nuts and bolts of a government operation is really where the work gets done. And the fact that he is focusing his people on the deep level technological tools that are available within these agencies is very savvy on his part. As I said earlier, I don't think the courts let him get away with all of this. And I think he'll see some pushback, not just from Democrats in Congress, but from some Republicans as well, when their sacred cows are being gored. But it does indicate, like I said, a real savviness on his part. And even if it's not quite as high profile, it's certainly much more impactful. And Diana, I apologize. You've been incredibly patient. So why don't you wind us up for the night?
Okay, mine is about Ukraine again. I put something in the chat. I was listening to CNN earlier today, and they were doing a debunking of some of the statements that Trump had made. And they said from an independent research group that who keeps track of all expenditures in Ukraine, that Europe has spent a lot more money than the US did. And they gave the money pledged and the money given. We had a big difference between the money pledged and the money given. Can Trump just stop that from us fulfilling our pledges there?
So two things. One, your point, both in the chat and verbally, is exactly right. And which I should have clarified when I was talking earlier, is that the US has spent more than any individual country.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And but Europe collectively has spent more, and I appreciate you clarifying that. So thank you. As far as what a president can do, that's a question that ultimately be decided judicially. One of the things that Trump and his director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought, believe is they believe in what's called the unitary theory of government, that a president is not obligated to spend money allocated by Congress. Now, for most of our nation's history, it wasn't anything anyone thought about. They knew that a president couldn't spend money unless Congress had allocated it. It never occurred to them that the president would not spend money that Congress had allocated. And so there's a difference of opinion on this. This unitary theory is relatively new and not nearly as widespread or popular as the more traditional belief that a president is obligated to spend that money. But it's something that will be settled by the courts. And if you remember, and I'm really glad you raised this in the context of Ukraine, not USAID or the Department of Education, it's worth remembering what Trump's first impeachment was about. Congress allocated money, and he chose not to spend it. And a Democratic Congress believed that that was an impeachable offense. A Republican Congress clearly does not believe that's the case, which means it is something that will go to the courts and ultimately just be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. My guess, and as I said earlier, I'm not a legal expert or a court watcher, is I think that while Roberts looks for opportunities to help Trump when he can, I think Roberts, as much as any elected politician, spends a lot of time thinking about his legacy. And he wants to be remembered once he steps down as a Chief Justice who is unifying rather than polarizing.
Wow.
And so my guess is, and it's just a guess, that they won't say that the unitary approach is unconstitutional, but it'll have some pretty strict limits on it. And so that means that a president, whether Trump or Biden or Gavin Newsom someday, isn't obligated to spend money that Congress allocates. Yeah, I think it's funny too, Tim. I just couldn't come up with a name off the top of my head. He's been thinking about it for 55 years. Why don't we? But I do think that it's something that will be allowed, but under much stricter circumstances than Trump and vote currently believe is allowable. But that may end up being the most important decision the Supreme Court makes during the next Trump administration. So I'm really, really glad you raised it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really great questions today, all of you. And I say this as a compliment and an admission. Really hard questions. I don't know if that's a natural byproduct of the Trump era, or if you guys have just decided to start pushing back harder, but either way, really, really interesting and important questions. So thank you all very much. And like I tell you every month, as much as I enjoy the webinar, this half an hour or so for me is much, much more enjoyable because of how intelligent the questions are. And I do hope that I know it's going to be somewhat of a trek for Roger, but for the rest of you, if we do begin doing these hybrid, I hope at least some of you will be able to come and join us in person so I get to meet you face to face.